The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked slowly beside his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II. The elderly monarch moved with careful steps, her walking stick tapping gently against the ancient stone pathway. George had noticed how his grandmother seemed more fragile lately, though she still carried herself with the same dignity that had defined her reign for over 7 decades. The Queen's Guard stood at attention throughout the palace grounds, their red uniforms pristine, and their faces expressionless beneath the iconic bearskin hats. These were men who had dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, standing motionless for hours regardless of weather or circumstance. George had grown up seeing them, but today something felt different about their presence. As they walked through the rose garden, the Queen paused to admire the blooming flowers. Her breathing seemed labored, and George noticed how she gripped her walking stick more tightly than usual. The morning was crisp, with autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the last of the season's roses. "Grandmother, would you like to sit for a moment?" George asked, his young voice filled with genuine concern. He had inherited his father's thoughtful nature and his great-grandmother's keen observation skills. The Queen smiled softly at her great-grandson. "That would be lovely, dear," she replied, though George could hear the slight wheeze in her voice that had become more noticeable in recent weeks. They made their way to a stone bench positioned beneath an ancient oak tree. The bench had been placed there decades ago, offering a perfect view of the castle's impressive architecture and the carefully manicured gardens. As they settled down, George noticed one of the Queen's Guards positioned nearby, standing perfectly still as protocol demanded. The guard was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with kind eyes that occasionally glanced toward the Queen with obvious respect and concern. George had seen this particular guard before during family gatherings and official events. There was something about his demeanor that suggested he genuinely cared about the royal family's well-being, not just as a duty, but as a personal commitment. As the minutes passed, George observed his grandmother more closely. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her coat, and she seemed to be struggling to catch her breath. The autumn morning, which had started pleasantly cool, now felt chilly as clouds began to gather overhead. "Are you feeling all right, grandmother?" George asked quietly, moving closer to her on the bench. The Queen patted his hand reassuringly, but George could feel how cold her fingers were despite the mild weather. "Just a bit tired, my dear. These old bones aren't what they used to be." George looked around the garden, taking in the peaceful surroundings that had been his playground and learning ground for as long as he could remember. This was where his grandmother had taught him about the history of their family, about the weight of responsibility that came with their position, and about the importance of serving their people with humility and grace. The young guard continued to stand motionless, but George noticed subtle signs of his attention to the Queen's condition. The soldier's eyes moved almost imperceptibly toward them every few moments, and his posture, while maintaining perfect military bearing, seemed somehow more alert than usual. As they sat together, the Queen began to share stories from her childhood, tales George had heard before but never tired of hearing. She spoke of her father, King George VI, and how he had prepared her for a role she never expected to inherit. She described the weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, and how it had shaped every decision she had made for more than 70 years. "You know, George," she said softly, "leadership isn't about commanding others. It's about understanding when to show strength and when to show vulnerability. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone around you, from prime ministers to the guards who protect us." George listened intently, though he couldn't help but notice that his grandmother's voice was growing weaker. Her usual commanding presence seemed diminished, and for the first time in his young life, he truly understood that she was not the invincible figure he had always believed her to be. The guard nearby shifted almost imperceptibly, and George realized that the soldier was genuinely concerned about the Queen's well-being. This wasn't just professional duty. There was real human emotion behind the ceremonial facade. As the morning progressed, more clouds gathered overhead, and the temperature began to drop. The Queen pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, but George could see that she was growing more uncomfortable. Her breathing became more labored, and she occasionally closed her eyes as if gathering strength. "Perhaps we should go inside, grandmother," George suggested gently. The Queen nodded slowly, acknowledging that she needed to rest. As she began to stand, using her walking stick for support, George noticed her legs seemed unsteady. The simple act of rising from the bench, something she had done countless times throughout her life, now appeared to require significant effort. George quickly moved to help her, offering his arm for support. Despite being only 10 years old, he instinctively understood the importance of maintaining his grandmother's dignity while providing the assistance she clearly needed. The Queen accepted his help gratefully, leaning more heavily on both her walking stick and her great-grandson than she would normally allow others to see. As they began their slow journey back toward the castle, George felt the weight of responsibility settling on his young shoulders in a way he had never experienced before. The guard watched their progress with obvious concern, maintaining his position but clearly torn between his duty to remain stationary and his human instinct to offer assistance. The internal struggle was evident in the tension around his eyes, though his training kept him perfectly still. As they walked, the Queen stumbled slightly on the uneven stone pathway. George steadied her immediately, but the moment made clear just how fragile she had become. The woman who had met with world leaders, weathered national crises, and maintained unwavering strength throughout decades of public service was showing her mortality in a way that deeply affected her young great-grandson. "Take your time, grandmother," George said softly, adjusting his pace to match her labored steps. "There's no hurry at all." The Queen squeezed his arm gratefully, and George could feel the tremor in her hand. The walk that would normally take 5 minutes was stretching much longer, but George remained patient, understanding instinctively that this moment was about more than simply getting his grandmother back to the safety of the castle. The young guard continued to watch their slow progress, and George began to form an idea. He had been raised to understand the protocols and traditions of royal life, but he had also been taught about compassion and humanity. As he looked at the soldier's concerned face, George realized that rigid adherence to protocol might not always serve the greater good. The wind picked up slightly, causing the Queen to shiver despite her warm coat. George could see that the remaining distance to the castle, while not great, might prove challenging for his grandmother in her current condition. He knew that calling for assistance would bring immediate help, but it would also create a spectacle that might embarrass the Queen and undermine the dignity she had worked so hard to maintain throughout her reign. George continued to support his grandmother as they made their way across the courtyard, but with each step, it became increasingly clear that she was struggling more than she would admit. The Queen's pride and sense of duty had always prevented her from showing weakness, even in private moments with family. However, George could see through her composed exterior to the genuine difficulty she was experiencing. The young guard remained at his post, but George noticed the soldier's growing concern. The man's eyes darted between his duty to maintain position and his obvious desire to help the struggling monarch. George understood that the guard was trapped between protocol and human compassion, a conflict that the young prince found deeply moving. As they paused for the Queen to catch her breath, George made a decision that would demonstrate wisdom far beyond his 10 years. He approached the guard with quiet confidence, understanding that what he was about to do might break with tradition, but served a higher purpose. "Excuse me," George said softly to the guard, his young voice carrying an unexpected note of authority. "I think my grandmother could use some assistance, but I don't want to cause a fuss or make her feel embarrassed." The guard's eyes showed surprise at being addressed directly, but he maintained his rigid posture as training demanded. However, George could see the internal struggle playing out behind the soldier's disciplined facade. The young prince recognized that he was asking this man to make a choice between following strict protocol and responding to a human need. "I know you're supposed to stay at your post," George continued, his voice gentle but persuasive. "But I think right now, helping my grandmother is more important than following rules. She's trying to be strong, but she needs help." The guard's expression softened almost imperceptibly. George could see that his words had reached the man's heart, touching something deeper than military discipline. The soldier's eyes moved to where the Queen stood, clearly struggling but attempting to maintain her regal bearing. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the guard remained frozen between duty and compassion. George watched patiently, understanding that he was asking this man to make a significant decision. Breaking protocol, even for the royal family, could have serious consequences for a guard's career. Then, slowly, the guard's rigid posture began to relax. His training had taught him to protect the royal family, and perhaps protecting the Queen's health and dignity was more important than maintaining a ceremonial position. The soldier's eyes met George's, and, in that moment, an understanding passed between them that transcended rank and protocol. Without saying a word, the guard stepped away from his position and moved toward the queen. His approach was respectful and gentle, clearly designed to offer assistance without causing embarrassment or undermining her dignity. The soldier's experience and training showed in how carefully he handled the delicate situation. "Your Majesty," the guard said quietly, "perhaps you would allow me to escort you back to the castle? The path can be quite uneven, and I would be honored to ensure your safe passage." The queen looked up at the young soldier, and George could see surprise and gratitude in her eyes. She had spent decades surrounded by protocol and formality, but this simple offer of human kindness seemed to touch her deeply. The guard's respectful manner and genuine concern clearly moved her. "That's very thoughtful of you," the queen replied, her voice soft but warm. "I would appreciate your assistance." George felt a surge of pride and relief as he watched the guard carefully position himself to support his grandmother without making her feel helpless. The soldier's movements were practiced and respectful, clearly born from genuine care rather than mere duty. The young prince realized that he had witnessed something special, the moment when humanity triumphed over rigid adherence to rules. As they began walking toward the castle, George noticed other guards throughout the courtyard. Word of their colleague's decision seemed to spread silently through their ranks, and George observed subtle nods of approval from the other soldiers. Rather than disapproval for breaking protocol, there appeared to be respect for choosing compassion over rigid rule-following. The queen walked more confidently now, supported by both George and the guard. Her breathing seemed less labored, and some of her natural dignity returned as she felt more secure in her movement. The assistance allowed her to focus on maintaining her composure rather than struggling with each step. "You know," the queen said to the guard as they walked, "in all my years, I've learned that true loyalty isn't about following rules blindly. It's about understanding when the spirit of service is more important than the letter of protocol." The guard's face showed deep emotion at these words. George could see that the queen's approval meant everything to this young man who had risked his position to help her. The soldier's decision had been validated by the very person he served, confirming that he had made the right choice. As they approached the castle entrance, George noticed palace staff beginning to gather, drawn by the unusual sight of a guard leaving his post. However, rather than concern or disapproval, George saw understanding in their faces. The staff members seemed to recognize the humanity of the moment and the rightness of the guard's decision. "Thank you," the queen said to the guard as they reached the entrance. "Your kindness will not be forgotten." The guard bowed respectfully, his face showing both relief and deep satisfaction. George realized that this man had just experienced something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The knowledge that he had chosen compassion over protocol and had been thanked by his queen for that choice. As palace attendants took over the queen's care, helping her inside where she could rest properly, George remained outside for a moment with the guard. The young prince wanted to express his gratitude for the man's kindness and courage. "Thank you for helping her," George said simply. "That took real courage." The guard looked down at the young prince with obvious respect. "Thank you for asking, Your Royal Highness. Sometimes it takes someone with fresh eyes to see what really matters." George understood that the guard was referring to more than just this single incident. The young prince had challenged traditional thinking and had shown that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. The soldier's words carried a weight that suggested this moment had taught them both something important about leadership and humanity. As George finally went inside to check on his grandmother, he reflected on what had just occurred. He had learned that true leadership sometimes meant breaking rules for a higher purpose, that protocol should serve people rather than the other way around, and that small gestures of humanity could have profound impact. The incident had also shown George the character of the people who served his family. The guard's willingness to risk his position for the queen's well-being demonstrated a level of loyalty and caring that went far beyond mere duty. These were people who genuinely cared about the royal family as human beings, not just as symbols or institutions. Inside the castle, George found his grandmother resting comfortably in her private sitting room. Her color had returned, and she seemed much more herself after the ordeal. Palace physicians had been called as a precaution, but the queen appeared to be suffering from nothing more serious than fatigue and the effects of the cool morning air. "Grandmother," George said as he sat beside her, "I'm glad you're feeling better." The queen smiled at her great-grandson, her eyes bright with affection and something that looked like pride. "You showed remarkable judgment out there, George. Understanding when rules need to be set aside for human kindness is one of the most important lessons a future king can learn." George felt a warm glow at his grandmother's approval. But, more importantly, he understood that he had learned something fundamental about leadership and responsibility. The morning's events had taught him that true strength sometimes meant accepting help, that genuine loyalty went beyond following orders, and that small acts of humanity could create profound connections between people. Later that afternoon, as news of the morning's events quietly spread through the palace corridors, George found himself thinking deeply about what had transpired. The incident had revealed layers of meaning that continued to unfold in his young mind, teaching him lessons about leadership, humanity, and the complex relationship between tradition and compassion. The young guard's name was James Mitchell, George learned from the palace staff. He was 23 years old, had served in the Queen's Guard for 2 years, and came from a military family with a long tradition of royal service. His decision to break protocol had not gone unnoticed by his superiors, and George worried about the consequences the young man might face for his act of kindness. That afternoon, George sought out his father, Prince William, to discuss the morning's events. He found the Prince of Wales in his study, reviewing official correspondence, but William immediately set aside his work when he saw the serious expression on his son's face. "Father, I need to tell you about something that happened this morning with grandmother," George began, settling into the chair across from his father's desk. As George recounted the events, he watched his father's face carefully. Prince William listened with growing interest, particularly when George described his conversation with the guard and the man's decision to help the Queen despite protocol. The future king's expression showed both pride in his son's judgment and concern for his grandmother's well-being. "You handled that situation with remarkable wisdom, George," Prince William said when his son finished the story. "Understanding when humanity should take precedence over protocol is perhaps the most important lesson any future monarch can learn." George felt relieved by his father's approval, but his concern for Guard Mitchell remained strong. "Father, what will happen to the guard? I asked him to help, but I'm worried he might get in trouble for breaking the rules." Prince William's smile was warm and reassuring. "Let me handle that, George. I think we can ensure that Guard Mitchell's compassion is recognized rather than punished." That evening, an extraordinary meeting took place in the palace's main conference room. Prince William had called together the captain of the Queen's Guard, several senior palace officials, and representatives from the royal household staff. The topic of discussion was Guard Mitchell's actions and their implications for royal protocol. "Gentlemen," Prince William began, "we need to discuss this morning's incident involving my grandmother and Guard Mitchell. While the guard's actions technically broke protocol, they demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and compassion we hope to see in those who serve the royal family." The captain of the Queen's Guard, a stern man with decades of military service, initially expressed concern about maintaining discipline and protocol. However, as the discussion progressed, it became clear that Mitchell's actions had actually embodied the highest ideals of royal service, protecting and caring for the monarch's well-being above all else. "Your Royal Highness," the captain said thoughtfully, "perhaps this incident shows us that our protocols need to be flexible enough to accommodate human judgment in exceptional circumstances." Guard Mitchell's actions demonstrated loyalty of the highest order. Prince William nodded approvingly. "I believe this incident should be seen as an example of exemplary service rather than a breach of protocol. Guard Mitchell showed that he understood the true spirit of his duty, which is to protect and serve the royal family's well-being." Meanwhile, George spent the evening with his grandmother, who had recovered completely from her morning fatigue. They sat together in her private sitting room, sharing tea and continuing their conversation about leadership and responsibility. The Queen seemed particularly thoughtful about the day's events and their deeper significance. "George," the Queen said as she set down her teacup, "today taught me something important about the people who serve us." That young guard saw past the uniform and protocol to recognize a human being who needed help. That kind of perception and courage is rare and precious. George listened carefully, understanding that his grandmother was processing the emotional impact of the guard's kindness. For someone who had spent decades surrounded by formal protocol, the simple human gesture of support had clearly been deeply meaningful. "I've been thinking about making some changes to our protocols," the Queen continued. "Perhaps it's time to acknowledge that rigid rules can sometimes prevent our people from serving us in the most meaningful ways." Guard Mitchell showed us that true loyalty sometimes means having the courage to act on human instinct rather than simply following orders. The next morning brought unexpected developments that would validate the wisdom of the previous day's events. Prince William had arranged for Guard Mitchell to be commended rather than disciplined for his actions. The young soldier was called to a private meeting where he would learn the consequences of his choice to help the Queen. George asked to be present for this meeting, feeling a personal responsibility for the guard situation. Prince William agreed, recognizing that this would be an important learning experience for his son about leadership and taking responsibility for one's decisions. When Guard Mitchell entered the meeting room, his face showed a mixture of apprehension and dignity. He clearly understood that his career might be at stake, but his posture suggested no regret for his choice to help the Queen. George admired the young man's courage in facing the consequences of his compassionate action. Guard Mitchell, Prince William began formally. We're here to discuss your actions yesterday morning when you left your post to assist Her Majesty the Queen. The young soldier stood at attention, prepared to accept whatever judgment was about to be delivered. George felt nervous for him, hoping that the decision would recognize the nobility of his actions rather than simply punishing the protocol violation. Your actions, Prince William continued, demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment, compassion, and loyalty that we value most highly in those who serve the royal family. Rather than disciplinary action, you're being commended for exemplary service. The relief and gratitude on Guard Mitchell's face was immediately apparent. George felt a surge of happiness and pride, both for the guard's recognition and for his father's wisdom in handling the situation. The young prince realized he was witnessing leadership in action, the ability to see beyond rules to recognize and reward the right kind of character. Furthermore, Prince William added, your actions have prompted us to review and update our protocols to ensure that our people can use their judgment to serve the royal family's best interests, even when that means departing from standard procedures. Guard Mitchell's eyes showed deep emotion as he understood the full implications of what was being said. Not only was he being praised rather than punished, but his actions had contributed to positive changes that would benefit others in similar situations in the future. George stepped forward, feeling it was important to acknowledge his own role in the situation. Guard Mitchell, I want to thank you again for helping my grandmother. Your kindness meant everything to both of us. The young soldier looked at George with obvious respect and gratitude. Thank you, Your Royal Highness. I'm honored to serve your family, and I'm grateful for your understanding. As the meeting concluded, George reflected on the profound lessons of the past 2 days. He had learned that true leadership meant recognizing when rules needed to be set aside for human needs, that the best people were those who could balance duty with compassion, and that small acts of kindness could have far-reaching positive consequences. The incident also taught George about the character of the people who served his family. Guard Mitchell's willingness to risk his career for the Queen's well-being showed that the royal household was staffed by people of genuine integrity and caring. These were individuals who saw beyond titles and protocol to the human beings they served. Most importantly, George learned that his own actions and decisions, even at his young age, could have significant impact on others' lives. His choice to approach the guard and ask for help had set in motion events that not only assisted his grandmother, but also led to positive changes in palace protocol and recognition for a deserving young man. In the weeks that followed, the story of Guard Mitchell's kindness and George's wisdom spread quietly through the palace community. It became an example of the values that the royal family hoped to embody: compassion, wisdom, and the courage to do what was right rather than what was merely expected. The Queen made a full recovery from her momentary fatigue, but the memory of that morning remained with her as a reminder of the humanity and loyalty of those who served her. Guard Mitchell continued his service with renewed pride and purpose, knowing that his character had been recognized and valued. George carried the lessons of that day forward into his future role as a leader. The experience had taught him that being a prince meant more than following protocols. It meant understanding when to show strength and when to show vulnerability, when to uphold tradition and when to embrace change, and, most importantly, when to choose compassion over convention. The subtle gesture that had begun with a young prince's concern for his grandmother had rippled outward to touch many lives, demonstrating that even small acts of humanity could create profound and lasting change. It was a lesson in leadership that would stay with George throughout his life, shaping his understanding of what it truly meant to serve others with wisdom, compassion, and courage.